Morning everyone, could I welcome you all to today's meeting of the Public Petitions Committee, and as always can I ask everyone to turn off their mobile phones or electronic devices because it does interfere with our sound systems. So agenda item 1 is PE 1458, a register of interest for members of Scotland's judiciary, and the first item of business is consideration of petition PE 1458 by Peter Chirby on a register of interest for members of Scotland's judiciary. As previously agreed, the committee will take evidence from Ali, who is the Judicial Complaints Reviewer, and members have a note by the clerk, it's paper 1 in submissions, and could you please all note that there's been a late submission from the petitioner, Peter Chirby, which was circulated Friday, and hard copies have been placed on members' desks. And could I welcome Ali to our meeting today? Thanks very much for coming along. The committee is very grateful for the opportunity to put questions and points to you. We won't ask for an opening statement, so I'll put a few questions to you, and my colleagues will then also do that, and then we'll decide what the next step should be on our petition. So the first one, just really to set the scene, a very straightforward question. Perhaps could you describe what the role of the Judicial Complaints Reviewer is?
It's a new role. I've just finished my second year in office. I'm the first JCR. I suppose I'm a bit like an ombudsman, but without the teeth, in that I can review the Judicial Office for Scotland's handling of complaints. So I don't have ombudsman's powers to actually make any determination other than that they were handled in accordance with the rules or not. So it's quite a limited role. It's a part-time role, 3 days a month on average, in fact 3 days a month maximum. I operate on a shoestring budget of £2,000 a year. Yes, you look impressed by that. What else can I say? I've handled about, I think I'm coming up to about complaint number 54 at the moment. It was a slow sort of start-up, but obviously that's built up really during the second year.
Thanks very much for that. It's useful, I think, to explain to the committee what your role is. Clearly, there's been some coverage of this particular issue in this petition. I mean, one of the arguments from the judiciary is, well, we don't need the register because there's strong constraints already in the system, such as the judicial oath. How strong do you think that argument is? Is the judicial oath, among the other devices that are there to protect the public, strong enough?
From the people who've written to me, I think it clearly isn't. I haven't had a large number of complaints, so I have to stress that we're not talking large numbers here. But issues have been raised with me about undeclared family relationships, for example. Concerns have been raised with me about memberships of a variety of organisations. So I think it's important to separate really judicial independence, which obviously I think we all treasure, and it's a cornerstone of democracy, and the separate issue of accountability. And I think the two go hand in hand, and I think really having a clear and published register of interests actually sort of sits above that. So where am I leading with this? I think that the more open you can be, the better. And obviously, this is another strand that I think sits above the judicial oath that really lists things that might not be covered by that. I mean, things like, as I say, family relationships, memberships of particular organisations that might be seen as incompatible, friendships. I mean, there's a whole sort of wide range of issues, really. It's difficult to itemise them all, but they're issues that have been raised with me through complaints, where members of the public feel that actually there are a host of things that are undeclared. Unless you go out and look for them, you're not necessarily going to know about them, and that if there were a register of interest and it was published, you could obviously just refer to one point and assure yourself that, that if a recusal is necessary, then you would have the information to ask for that if it didn't happen automatically. And obviously, members of the judiciary do recuse themselves as appropriate. But I think the issue here is that sometimes members of the public perceive there to be a conflict of interest, but without that register of interests, it's really difficult to say, well, actually, you know, here it is on the register, and this is what we think may be an issue.
But I think one of the points the petitioner is making, if I paraphrase him, is there's a register of interest for ministers, for MSPs, for MPs. If it's good enough for the politicians, why is it not good enough for the judiciary? How would you respond to that?
I think I would agree with that. I mean, I think in the 21st century, pretty much everyone, I'd be hard-pressed to think of people who are not expected to register their interests in some form or other. And I think, if anything, the move is towards even more transparency. So in the past, a register of interests would be something locked away in a cabinet, whereas today, virtually all organisations publish it on the internet, and it's easily and widely available. So I think that the public trend is towards more and more openness and more accessibility. And I think, as I say, hand in hand with judicial independence has to go accountability. And accountability, I think, really says, you know, these are what our interests are. Everybody else declares them. It's difficult to argue as to why that should not happen for one sector of society, I think.
Thank you very much for that, and I'll throw them to my colleagues to ask questions. Can I start with Chick Brodie?
Thank you. Good morning. I wonder, before I get to the main meat of the questions I have, you say your budget is £2,000 and you've had 54 complaints?
Over a 2-year period.
Right. Is there a problem in, I mean, clearly £2,000 is a problem, but have you any feel for the number of complaints you might get if there was more substance behind? I'm not saying there's not any substance behind your job, but in terms of raising the profile and making people aware much more widely of what the role is?
I think probably not, and the reason for that is that the way the complaint system is structured, you have to make a complaint through the judicial office, and when you get the final letter from the judicial office, it makes reference to me as the reviewer. So I think people are aware, if they've gone through the complaint system, that I exist. So I think having a larger budget would make my life easier, but I don't think it would actually make any impact on the number of complaints that I receive. I think that is what it is.
Okay. Right, I wonder if I may, understanding that you can't discuss specific complaints, you have, however, referred to various cases where complaints have been raised suggesting bias in the judiciary. In order that we can get a feel for the extent of any problem, it might be useful, you know, if we can understand the general nature of complaints that have been made to you suggesting bias. Can you do that?
I can. I mean, what I've done in an anonymous form is I have approached 3 people who've made complaints of that nature and asked them to supply me with a paragraph summarising the complaint and then a paragraph on their views on whether a register of interests would have helped. And I've put X and Y in, so I don't know if you want me quickly to run through those for you. I mean, the first case is, I'll call him Mr. A, who says, and these are his words, not mine, basically, in a nutshell, I'm saying judges in Scotland are routinely sitting on cases when they ought not to. Regarding my own case, had the 2 judges, Lord X and Y, declared their interest in my case, I would have definitely asked them to recuse themselves. By not doing so, they have brought the judiciary into disrepute. A register of interest would have thrown up in my own case that the judges are sitting in judgment of their father's case, and that prosecutors, now judges, are routinely sitting in judgment on their own cases at appeal level, when, according to the Dean of Faculty, natural justice demands a judge cannot judge his own cause. And it goes on to talk about, a classic example is the name changes they make to hide their links to other judges. Lord X was the father of Lord Y, for example, Lord A and Lord B are brothers. And then he goes on to talk about somebody who contacted him, who I'll call Joe Bloggs, who tells me that he took a judicial review against X organisation for refusing to refer his case back to the appeal court. His judicial review was presided over by the brother of the judge that originally rejected the appeal. Had Mr. Bloggs been aware of this at the time of his judicial review, he assures me that he would have asked Lord X to recuse himself from his judicial review. And it goes on to say that he never thought of looking for any kind of relationship between judges, and in any event, they had different names, so how is he expected to relate to them? So that's one example of family relationships. A second example is the case of Mr. C, who has concerns about social relationships between members of the judiciary. In my opinion, there is no transparency within the judiciary, making a register of interests essential to enable public confidence to be improved. This would give anyone appearing in a court case the necessary information, if necessary, to request a judge recuse himself from a case where there can be demonstrated a conflict of interest, if the judge has not already taken that action himself. The register of interests could also cover, number 1, attendance at social activities by a judge, which are organised and also attended by a party in a court case over which he, the judge, is presiding. Impartiality is essential to the proper discharge of the judicial office and to improve public confidence. And then he goes on to talk about special or personal friendships between judicial members and how that can have an impact. And then finally, the third example that I've brought is an organisation, not an individual, who wrote to me seeking a review. And this is about a member of the judiciary who is a member of an organisation that organisation feels is incompatible with their judicial role. And they say, a register of interests in small part addresses this matter. We are of the opinion that any register of interests, if it is to serve the public interest, must incorporate legislation / provisions which allow declared interests of the judiciary to be challenged and remedied where appropriate. It is crucial that this be independent of the judicial office. By this means, our 2-year experience of questioning the personal judgment of one member of the judiciary, resulting in the conclusion that the judicial office was possibly protecting its own, need never be repeated. So those are 3 real-life cases that I have been involved in reviewing.
Okay, thank you. It's fair to say that, based on one of the examples that you've given, that most judges move in the same circle. Do you believe that they might discuss individual cases, or?
I honestly, I couldn't comment on that. I don't know.
Mm-hmm. I wonder, in terms of what we're trying to do is seek some transparency and try and understand why some judges or those that manage, in inverted commas, the judiciary, believe that they're above the law in terms of bias. I wonder if you can perhaps give your views on having more transparency in depth and confirm whether you think that that is a goal in itself or is relevant to whatever decisions that are made by the judiciary.
I think really having more transparency in any area of life can only be a good thing. I know that it brings a downside, and obviously I've read the response to the petition, which is that it's intrusive and could attract negative media reaction. And I think in a way that goes hand in hand with accountability, that you have to have an awareness of the impact that your actions might have if you have a high role in public life. But I think that greater transparency enhances the credibility of any group of people, whether it's members of boards, whether it's politicians, whether it's the judiciary. And I think what came through very strongly to me in the examples that I've read out to you, and they're these people's words, not my words, is that they all felt that having more openness, more transparency, would actually enhance the judiciary. And I think that's very true. I genuinely don't think that there's widespread bad practice among judicial office holders. I genuinely don't believe that. But I think public perception is really important. And I think that sometimes things happen that shouldn't happen. And without openness, it's very difficult to identify that. And I think when identified, the feeling that I get from the people who write to me is that there's cover-up. I think it's very easy to believe that there's cover-up if there isn't transparency. So I think that actually by having more transparency, the judiciary would be doing themselves a favour by saying, look, there isn't anything to hide. And if we make mistakes, we'll admit to that.
I just wonder one last question, if I may, Convener. Why would you think that the protection of the judiciary, in terms of not having to subscribe to a register of interests, was written into the Constitution?
Ask the people who drafted the legislation. I don't know. I mean, this is speculation. It's long been the case in this country that there are particular groups who are harder to challenge. I think in the past, one such group was the medical profession. And I think it's very interesting to see now how, I mean, I had a look, for example, at the GMC website, the regulator of doctors, and they now, and I think they'd have resisted this strongly in the past, publish registers of interest and record family relationships of their council members and so on. But that at one time, I think it was very difficult for politicians to take on that particular group. I think perhaps it's very difficult to take on the judiciary, and I think the reason for that is that judicial independence is always mentioned. And as I said, it's a cornerstone of democracy. But I think because there's been no separation between accountability and independence, it's very easy for the judiciary to say, well, we're independent, so, you know, don't interfere in that. And I think unless you separate independence and accountability, you will continue to see legislation in which there is no requirement for more openness and transparency.
Thank you.
Thank you. Angus MacDonald.
Thank you. Good morning. In the spirit of the petition, I suppose I should refer members to my register of interest. Ms. Ali, you've indicated to the committee that you've had to complete registers of interest for roles in public bodies such as the Scottish Ambulance Service and the Scottish Police Authority. And you've also stated that you believe this isn't an onerous task or an onerous process. Can you give the committee a bit more detail with regard to your experience of completing these registers, and also expand on your view that such a role is not onerous?
Yes, it's very straightforward. Once a year, you're written to by the Secretariat, probably in a similar way to the way it operates for you, and you're given a pro forma to fill in. They're slightly different for each organisation, but generally ask you about family relationships, possibly the holding of shares or property, relationships with organisations that might have an impact on your decision making, that kind of thing. And it's really just a pro forma that takes no more than 10 minutes to fill in. You fill that in on year one, and on year two it comes back to you and you're asked if anything's changed, and obviously if there have been substantial changes in the interim, you notify the relevant board. And that's it. So 10 minutes in year one and perhaps 5 minutes in subsequent years. It couldn't be an easier thing to do.
David Torrance.
Good morning. The Lord President believes that the existing obligation of judicial independence and impartiality means that there is no need for a register, and that if such register existed, it could impact on the loss of privacy, and it would also be difficult for him to list all their registered interests. Could you comment on that, please?
To a degree, it does involve loss of privacy. I agree. I think that if you have a position in public life, as I do, I think the public have a right to know what gifts and hospitality I've accepted, or what companies I have an interest in. I think that's right. I think that goes with the terrain, and I think people who sit on boards for many years have accepted that the public have a right to that information. So I agree with the Lord President. I think it is intrusive, but I think that's the price that you pay in an open and accountable society.
Thank you.
John Wilson.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Ms Ali. Ms Ali, you commented earlier in terms of the judges would recuse themselves as appropriate. Now, one of the issues, and you expressed in terms of the evidence you gave, that one of the complainants indicated that if he knew the judge that was dealing with the case was the son of another judge, an appeal judge, how often do you think judges do recuse themselves? And do you think they recuse themselves when it is appropriate?
It's impossible for me to say. I mean, I really, all I can comment on are the people who write to me. That's the only evidence that I have. And I have had people write to me saying that they felt that a recusal should have happened and didn't. Beyond that, I really couldn't comment. I don't know.
So would you would agree that a register, a full disclosure register, because as an elected member of this Parliament, not only do I have to do an annual update of the register, but I also have to do a regular update if there have been any changes in terms of hospitality or other events or organisations that I become a member of. And that's done on a regular basis, not on an annual basis. Do you think that would assist the transparency and openness of the court's procedure if judges were asked to complete a register and maintain a register of interests, and not just pecuniary interests, but also of other interests that they may have?
Definitely, I do. I think the thing that comes through to me in everything that I've looked at, I mean, at the moment, on the Scottish Government website, there's consultation about the register of interests for board members. And the word that's used constantly throughout that is perception. And I think that's one of the key issues. It's about how the public perceive. So it's not, I'm not suggesting that there's widespread bad practice or nepotism or anything of that nature, but I think it's really important that justice has to be seen to be done as well as to be done. And I think, you know, what comes through time and again, I mean, just very briefly, I mean, the consultation that Scottish Government's doing at the moment on amendments to the Code of Conduct for members of devolved public bodies talks about things like this ensures transparency of your interests which might influence or be thought to influence your actions. And it goes on to, you must consider not only whether you will be influenced, but whether anybody else would think that you might be influenced. You must always remember that public interest points towards transparency. And it goes on in that vein. And I think for me that's the issue. It's about the public having confidence in the judicial system. And I think by having transparency, you actually build that public confidence, and that perception will alter. Because the thing that comes through to me strongly in most of the letters I receive is this feeling that people are all in cahoots. I'm not suggesting that the judiciary is, but there's this feeling that, well, there's this system and we don't really understand how it works, and the judicial office holders should have done this, but they didn't, and then I complain to the judicial office, but of course they look after their own. And, you know, this feeling that the whole thing is a big cover-up. And I don't believe generally that it is, but I think because there isn't the transparency, it's very easy for people to believe that that isn't the case.
And that, as you quite rightly said, Ms Ali, is the crux of the matter here in terms of this petition before us, is to try and get that situation where people don't feel that there is a close-knit community making decisions at a very senior level who have either relationships or colleagues that they could be seen to be protecting or supporting in terms of the judicial decisions that are being made in the courts. So could you give, or do you have any indication of how many judges have recused themselves in cases that they've been about to try or have tried?
I'm sorry, I don't know the answer to that.
There may be a question we might want to ask the Lord President in relation to the issue. We received a written submission as a committee from Mr Beck, and in his written submission he makes reference to judges having to recuse themselves, which is duly enshrined within the Bangalore Principles. Are you aware of the Bangalore Principles and what the Bangalore Principles set out for as a guidance for judges?
Only in passing. I couldn't claim to be an expert. But I mean, the Bangalore Principles are about judicial independence, for example, and cover the issue of recusal. It's left with the judicial office holder to take a decision on whether recusal is necessary or not. But again, I think that's probably a question for the Lord President.
And I thank you very much indeed.
Okay, Anne McTaggart.
Thanks, Convener, and good morning, Ms Ali. Earlier, your initial statement to the Convener explaining your role, out of the 54 cases that you do have, you kind of mentioned earlier that, you know, there wasn't that much power, it was toothless power. What kind of outcomes have you had from some of these 54 cases that you have undertaken?
I think the difficulty I have is that because I have a very restricted role, so when somebody makes a complaint about a judicial office holder, it's investigated by the Judicial Office for Scotland, and they investigate it according to what they call a set of rules. And my role is simply to sit with the set of rules and to sit with the case and to say, were the rules followed? So although I might not agree with the outcome of the complaint, I can only say the rules were followed or the rules were not followed. So it's difficult for me to say, I suppose it's difficult for me to answer that question because my role is simply to say yes, they were followed or no, they were not.
And if they're not followed?
If they're not followed, then I can make a referral to the Lord President. Again, I mean, it's a difference. In England and Wales, there is an ombudsman, and that ombudsman can say, well, actually, I don't think that was the right decision. You need to reinvestigate that, or you ought to do this, or you ought to do that. All I can do is say, the rules were not followed, Lord President. Here you are, and I can make no recommendation as to what should happen. And I'm not clear at this stage. I've written to the Lord President to try to understand whether I will always be told what happens as a result of... So at the moment, I have been told the outcome of my referrals to him. But I, a while back, sent another referral that I understood was going to be reinvestigated, but I haven't heard anything more. So I'm trying to clarify what the situation is, because I suppose my concern is that I might feel that the rules haven't been followed, send it back, and then never know what happens. So I'm seeking clarity on that because the rules don't say what happens at the point at which I then refer something back.
Okay. Thank you.
Just before I bring Jackson Carlo in, you made a comparison with England and Wales about the Ombudsman. The powers there presumably are a lot stronger and also a much bigger budget, I would suggest, than £2,000. Very briefly, could you give some comparisons of the difference between your role and the role in England and Wales?
It's very, very different. In England and Wales, there is an ombudsman. His role is twofold. He handles complaints about judicial office holders or reviews complaints in the same way that I do. And he also does reviews complaints about judicial appointments, so that, which is a completely separate matter. So he does both of those. But being an ombudsman, he can actually ask for an apology, he can ask for another investigation to happen. I mean, he has the full sort of suite of ombudsman powers, and can look at wider issues around maladministration, for example. Whereas I feel somewhat as if my hands are tied because I can make suggestions, but I can't do anything more than that. So I can say, for example, I think that the perception of the letters that you wrote were really unhelpful, unfriendly, off-putting, but I can't say change the way that you write letters to members of the public. So I suppose I have to be persuasive in my role, but I have no power to require any change in practice.
And in terms of, you know, administrative backup, is the £2,000 the entire nature of your budget? That seems very, very small.
I have no administrative support. I work from home and I do my own admin. My fees are additional to the £2,000 is for, well, everything except my fees.
Before, apologies to Jackson Carlo, I could just bring Chick Brodie in this point and then move to Jackson Carlo.
Can I ask, I am somewhat, appalled's probably a bit strong, but in terms of how we close the loop, when you write to the Lord President suggesting a course of action, you say you get no feedback at all?
No, I don't. What I'm saying is, well, I don't suggest a course of action because I'm not allowed to do that. I'll say the rules were not followed. It's over to you now. What I have had up until recently was when the Lord President wrote to the person who'd complained to me, a copy of that letter would be sent to me. So I knew the outcome of what had happened. But recently, there was a case that I referred back, and I was told that that would be reinvestigated, but I didn't hear anything more. And I asked the Judicial Office at one of my quarterly meetings what had happened to that, and they said that they couldn't tell me because obviously it was a matter for the Lord President. So I've written to the Lord President to ask him what I can expect, because I'm unhappy about referring things back and then not knowing what happened. So until now I have found out, but on this one particular case, which resulted in a reinvestigation, I don't know whether it's been reinvestigated or what the outcome of that was.
Are these subject to freedom of information provisions?
No, no. The Judicial Office's work is, the Lord President's isn't, and the Judicial Office's work is only FOIable if it doesn't involve the complaints handling aspect.
Thank you, Chick Brodie. Can I pass over to Jackson Carlo?
Thank you, Convener. Good morning. The petitioner himself has submitted some further evidence which is rather interesting, which points out that the Crown Office and the Procurator Fiscal Service operate a register of hospitality and interests. Therefore, other sections within the judicial system do. It seems without any of the adverse impacts that the Lord President has brought to us. From this committee's perspective, I think that what has been the focus of our attention here has been the Lord President's Edwardian establishment disdain for the hoi polloi, as I think he sees it, in terms of our having any right to understand these matters. And I wonder if you've put it rather more politely, but it does seem to me this morning that you're not a million ways away from characterising this as, you know, is this still the case that the swish of judicial ermine and velvet should cow into deference both the public and the legislature going forward in terms of our right to have some sort of understanding of these issues. And I think the point you make, and if I characterise it, I've maybe been a little bit more colourful, but I wonder if that's how you, if you would agree. But that in fact, in this day and age, the reason the Lord President appears to be against it is because it has not been so to date.
I can't speak for the Lord President, and I'd like to be as colourful as you are, but I feel I can't at the moment. But I think that with any institution, in any sector of society, change is not always welcomed. I think particularly change that is seen to be quite challenging. And most institutions resist that, and I think it would be fair to say that it's seen as something of a threat, when actually I prefer to see it as something of an opportunity.
Thank you.
John Wilson.
Thank you, Convener. Sally, you gave an indication earlier about how you handle complaints. And one of the examples you gave is where someone had made a complaint of someone sitting on the bench was a relative of someone else who had tried the case, or words to that effect. When a complaint like that comes into you, how do you verify the information that's provided to you when a complaint of, when you use the word nepotism, arises? How do you get the information to allow you to process the complaint to the Lord President?
I don't need to verify it because my role is only to look at whether the complaints rules were followed. So I don't investigate complaints, I don't handle complaints. My role is literally to say, when that complaint was made to the judicial office, did they follow the rules? So it's almost a sort of tick box thing. So I'm not looking at the complaint itself or at whether it was genuine or backed up by fact or anything like that. I'm simply looking at, did the judicial office do what they should have done with that complaint when it went to them?
At the present moment, what I'm picking up, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, is that you're at the mercy of the Lord President as to whether or not the Lord President deems it relevant or necessary to respond to you and to respond to the complaint.
Yes, I mean, I have no authority to suggest a course of action. If I find that the rules haven't been followed, I can simply say the rules were not followed and pass my report back to the Lord President, and the Lord President then has 4 options off the top of my head there: to do nothing, to reinvestigate, and variations of those 2. But it's up to the Lord President what to do with my report.
In relation to your first option there, the Lord President has the right to do nothing. How do you then respond to the complainant in terms of the issues raised by them in relation to the way they've been dealt with in the courts?
Unfortunately, my role ends when I write my report. So I write my report, I send a copy to the person who asked for the review, and I send a copy, if the rules have been breached, to the Lord President. And I have to explain to the person who complained to me that that is the end of my role, and that whatever decision is taken thereafter is the Lord President's. Inevitably, I get follow-up correspondence from people who say, well, you know, this is what the Lord, I don't understand why the Lord President decided to do this or decided to do that, or I don't understand this. And so there's often some follow-up correspondence which I try to help them to understand how the system works. But in terms of my role, it stops at the point at which I send out my reports. So there's no challenge to that. That's the end of the process. There's nowhere else except judicial review, which would seem slightly absurd.
No, you don't have any powers to hold the Lord President accountable for the recommendations or actions or lack of actions that the Lord President decides to take?
No.
Right, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Could I just one final follow-up from myself? We've talked a little bit about unintended consequences, and I think we said earlier that the Lord President had argued that a register could impact on the judiciary's privacy, but there's other aspects to that. It could also lead to harassment from the media, hostile individuals and so on. What's your own view on the Lord President's comments?
I can only talk about my own view as somebody who's completed a number of registers of interest, and that has been that there hasn't been any kind of adverse media comment, haven't been hounded by the press, that there hasn't been an issue. I think at the moment the press, I mean, how would I put it, have it in for the judiciary at the moment. I think the reason being that there is so much lack of transparency. I actually think the complete opposite would happen to what the Lord President fears would happen, that because there isn't transparency, the media feel that there's something to hide, and that they need to investigate and need to go off and find out more. And I think actually if you had the transparency, that would end, because it would all be there, laid out, and anybody could see it. So I genuinely think it would be the opposite.
Thanks very much for that. Does any other member of the committee have any final comments? John Wilson.
Thank you, Commissioner, for allowing me back in again. Ms Ali, the Lord President cites the Scotland Act 1998, and it's the section within the Scotland Act that says that judges or the judiciary are not accountable to this Parliament. Do you think the Lord President's interpretation of that section of the Act is correct, and that there should be, I accept in relation to judicial matters when they're dealing with cases at court, the Parliament should hold them to account for those types of decisions. But would you agree that the Scotland Act has to be looked at to allow the Parliament and the public to be able to hold judges, in terms of the register of interest, accountable for the issues that they're involved in?
Petition quite some distance,
Well, no, because...
which is about a register of interests.
Convener, the Lord President, as I understand it, has responded to say that they doesn't agree that there should be a register of interest because it's protected under the Scotland Act 1998. And my question directly relates to that Act as it currently is set out, because the Lord President has cited that Act as the reason why he doesn't have to either give evidence to this committee or provide a register of interest.
Just to clarify, because Jackson Howell did ask me to look at that particular issue. The background, I think John Wilson's explained, is that we did ask the Lord President to appear before us, and the Scotland Act has a provision which states that the judiciary cannot be required to appear before the committee. You may notice, I think the Lord President's next door at another committee. If the Lord President wishes to go voluntarily, that's entirely up to him. However, we have made arrangements for Chick Brodie, the Deputy Convener, and myself to meet the Lord President in a few weeks' time. So that's the background, just because you won't be fully aware of all our previous discussions. I'm conscious of time, so if you could make that a fairly brief answer, that would be very helpful.
Of course. I think it goes back to the earlier point I made about judicial independence, and clearly politicians should have no part in influencing in any way judicial decisions. And I think everyone would agree with that. But judicial accountability is a completely separate issue, and I think being accountable for your actions... I mean, I'm independent of government. My role is also independent of the judiciary. But I'm here before you today because I believe that I'm accountable to the public through Parliament. And you have no right to influence any decisions I make, but you have every right to expect me to appear here before you and to give evidence. And I think the same applies, that separating judicial decision-making, which must remain independent, with judicial accountability, I think that's the issue that cuts through all of this for me.
Well, just before the committee make a decision on the next steps, could I personally thank you for coming along today? I certainly found your evidence very enlightening and very, very helpful indeed. I'm sure I speak for other committee members as well. And I know it's not always easy appearing before a committee, so thank you for that. If you just stay where you are for just a second. The next steps for us to look at what different actions we should consider for the petition. Members will have their own views. Certainly, I still think it would be useful to get the views of Dr. Kennedy Graham, the MP at New Zealand Parliament, who's had a heavy track record on the wider issues around this. But could I throw it over to committee members for their views on next steps? Jackson Callan?
I do think the petitioner, in raising the issue of the Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service having a register of interest, and specifically, in fact, dealing with the issues of harassment, privacy, and undue harm to the justice system, which appear not to have materialised, I think it would be useful to get some sort of confirmation of that as the operational outcome, because I think it does go to the heart of the Lord President's assertions.
Useful if we wrote to the head of each of these services rather than
I think so, yes, in the first instance.
Us.
Yes, in the first instance.
Members?
I think it directly contradicts in a very relevant way the concerns advanced as in opposition to the petition.
Thank you for that. Are members agreeable with that course of action? Angus MacDonald?
Yes, I think we should bear in mind one aspect of this morning's session, which highlighted the issue of the JCR's referrals to the Lord President. I think we should seek clarification on the procedure following a referral of cases to the Lord President by the Judicial Complaints Reviewer, and whether they're all followed up. If we've heard of a case where there's one in particular that hasn't been followed up as yet. So given the example we've heard this morning, it may be an issue that you could raise with the Lord President when you meet in a few weeks' time.
If the committee are agreeable, I'm sure Chick Brodie would be happy to raise it. Jackson Carlow?
I mean, I'm happy for that. I do feel that which I thought was a very important area that emerged today, definitely strays rather beyond the terms of the petition that we are investigating. But I do think it is of material interest and potentially should, following any discussion you have, be referred to the Justice Committee as a matter that they may very well wish to look at if they have not done previously. And of course, we can't know that.
Yeah, that's a fair point. So if committee agreeable, we'll raise that, and then when we come to look at this petition again, we can talk about whether we need to refer other matters to justice. Would that be acceptable? Other members have Chip Brodie?
I don't think it would be acceptable. I'd love to understand the rationale behind the point that John Wilson made in terms of why and who wrote it into the Act, and the basis of writing into the Act the fact that the Lord President should not declare, or the judiciary should not declare a register of interest. I suspect we wouldn't get to that information, but it certainly would be very interesting to see how and why and where and when that decision was made.
So the clerk's just advising me, of course, that we can ask Spice to research the debate in Westminster. I think I was actually there at the time, but I'm not sure if I've spoken this. But we will look do some research on this, and we'll feed that back to the committee. It is a point of historic interest, I think, that feeds our wider argument. Do members have any other course of action, or are they happy with the points we've raised? John Wilson?
I'd wish the committee to keep the Scottish Government fully appraised of the evidence that we have received to date on this issue. And Jackson Carlo is right, some of the issues that we've discussed today do go beyond the actual petition and just asking for a register, but I think it would be useful to keep the Scottish Government appraised of the discussions that have been taking place and the issues that have arisen because of our consideration of this petition, and whether or not the Scottish Government would be minded, one, to review the judicial reviewer's role in relation to the issues that have been raised this morning, because clearly we have got to build confidence in the judicial system that we have in Scotland, and we have the Ombudsman's position, which is a formal position and can actually make recommendations in relation to public bodies. But clearly we have a judicial reviewer that, quite frankly, is not resourced to be able to carry out, I would argue, to the confidence of the general public, the decisions that are being made in the Scottish courts.
And on the back of John Wilson's point, of course, we could write, if members are agreeable, to Kenny McCaskill, putting these points to him and getting some feedback, which we can discuss at a future meeting if members are agreeable. Okay. So the course of action then is we're writing to Dr. Kennedy Graham, the MP at the New Zealand Parliament. We're following up some of the points that Jackson Carlo raised, and we're writing to Ken McCaskill, and we're also going to do some research via Spice on Hansard. And finally, could I thank Moali again for coming along. I thought it was excellent evidence, reopened my eyes on some of the issues on the practicalities here. Thank you very much for coming along, and I'll suspend for 1 minute to allow our witnesses to change round. If I could restart our committee, we're now on agenda item 2, consideration of new petitions. The next item for business is consideration of new petitions. There are 3 new petitions for consideration today. As previously agreed, the committee has invited the petitioners in to speak to each of them. The first new petition is PE 1482 by John Womersley on isolation in single-room hospitals. Members have a note by the clerk, the spice briefing and the petition. And can I welcome the petitioner? You're very welcome, sir. Thanks for coming along today. And the Reverend Douglas Irvin, who's the Minister at Kirkcudbright Parish Church, to our meeting. And again, Reverend Irvin, if there's any points you wish to raise any time during our questions, please feel free to intervene. And can also welcome Alec Ferguson, MSP, to the meeting today, who is a constituency interest. My intention is to ask Mr Womersley to make a short presentation of around 5 minutes. Followed by that, I'll ask Alec Ferguson if he'll make a brief statement, and then I'll have a few questions and ask my colleagues to add in after that. Mr Womersley.
Thank you very much for inviting us here to present the case for allowing a mix of shared accommodation and single rooms in new build Scottish hospitals. We've agreed, I think, with the clerk that we'll split the 5 minutes into 2.5 minute speeches, if that's okay. I'd like to make clear at the outset that we're advocating a substantial increase in the number of single rooms so that everyone who wants a single room can have one. But we feel that people that prefer to share accommodation in hospitals should be given their choice also. And when I talk about a mix of single rooms and mixed accommodation, we're not talking about going back to old-fashioned wards, but friendly 3- or 4-bedded bays with single rooms. People who prefer to share do so for a number of good reasons. Some just like company and some fear isolation, but there are real problems can arrive in single rooms. People feel they might miss a meal or they might not have access to enough water. That something might happen to them in a single room that's not noticed, even cardiac arrest perhaps. And there have been cases well publicised. There was a case of a man called Cain Gorney in London who was so thirsty in his single room that he telephoned the police to get water. But unfortunately, when the police arrived, they were told the patient was havering, and ultimately Cain Gorney died. And Anne Clwyd, Labour MSP in Cardiff, in the University of Wales Hospital in Cardiff, her husband was seriously mistreated in the single room, and you may have heard about the outcome of that about a year or so ago. So we think there are 3 main reasons for advocating this mix of room. First of all, I think there is really no evidence base for requiring single rooms, not even for infection control. The general feeling is that a 50-50 mix of single rooms and shared accommodation would be fine for infection control. And what evidence there is, in fact, is that for people in rehabilitation or palliative care, single rooms, sharing accommodation actually has a healing influence. Then there's local opinion. Public opinion. The government itself had sponsored a survey of 990 people across Scotland for their views of single rooms and what kind of accommodation they like in hospital, and only 41% expressed a strong preference for single rooms. The remainder saying they prefer to share or it would depend on the circumstances at the time. And a local survey in Dumfries and Galloway, where I come from, conducted in the hospital, came out with very similar results. As well as these surveys, there's evidence from advocacy service in Dumfries and Galloway, and evidence, in fact, from a general practitioner, a retired member of the health board, and a distinguished physician in Dumfries and Galloway, all trying to advocate this mixture of accommodation. And finally, of course, there's a matter of cost. Compared with a 50-50 mix of single and shared accommodation, the capital costs would be probably about 15% greater, and the running costs and nursing costs, of course, a bit more as well.
Chair, I speak from the perspective of having visited hospitals, both in the capacity as a parish minister and as a hospital chaplain part-time for over 30 years. So I think I've got a good grasp of people's feelings about it. And I've also been a patient in a single room situation as well as in the smaller ward situation, the latter for me personally. And I think for most people I have spoken to, the preferred option, giving a wholesome patient care experience and an ability to help each other in need. It's interesting that the Spiritual Care Committee of Dumfries and Galloway Health Board, of which I've been a member, and I'm a member, said, well, it's not for hospitals to delegate patient care responsibility to patients, but in fact, I think we're all our brother's keeper, and we all need to help each other in the wholesome experience that we can look to in hospital care. My most serious concern is about the denial of choice, and next year I'll be able to vote whether or not this country of ours should be independent or not. I have a choice, and in terms of worship in our church, we offer choice, and we look around everywhere, we are offered choice. The chief executive of the health board down where I live has conceded that when the new hospital at Dumfries, the infirmary, is built, I will not have any choice. I will not be able to be admitted to a shared ward facility. So there is denial of choice there to me. It's very good that we have the opportunity this morning to share our concerns with you, because I question to what extent MSPs have been able to exercise choice in relation to consideration of this matter. I'm not sure where the policy originated from. I suspect it may very well have been from the present Health Minister's predecessor and personal family experience. But I don't know to what extent that opportunity for you to express choice has unfolded on the floor of the chamber, and I do hope that this may afford fuller discussion of this very important matter, which affects all of us potentially in Scotland, and all of us around this table may very well one day be admitted to hospital. I have personal experience working with a family whose daughter was admitted to the hospital for observation, having hit her head following a night out. The mother phoned at 7 a.m. and asked, "How is my daughter?" "Oh, she's fine." 10 minutes later, there was a phone call to her. "I'm sorry, there's been a serious deterioration in your daughter's health." The parents rushed to the hospital to find their daughter dead. And I really seriously questioned whether there had been proper observation of that woman in the isolation of a single room. And I just lay before you the very real issue of foreseeable risk in patient care. I feel that the health boards themselves are being denied choice. They feel intimidated and constrained because they are told, you're not getting a new build hospital unless you agree that it be of single ensuite patient accommodation provision. And I feel, and I have tried with my own health board to say, look, can you not make representations to the Scottish Government? Yes, we have. But can you not point out the advantages to patients of choice and exercising their choice? So I would like you to take that on board. This morning at breakfast, I was being asked by the Polish girl who served me, "What are you here in Edinburgh for?" And I explained to her. And when she heard that this government's committed to such a huge expansion of this desire to have single on-site accommodation hospitals, she said, Scotland must be a very wealthy nation.
Thank you for that. Can I ask Alec Ferguson if he would like to make a brief contribution?
I'll make as brief a contribution as I can, Convener, and thank you for the opportunity. As has already been intimated, this debate kicked off in my constituency, really, with the announcement that a new hospital was going to be built and that it would be entirely consisting of single beds in accordance with Scottish Government policy. Now, Dumfries and Galloway, as any of you who are lucky enough to visit it will probably realise quite quickly, has quite an elderly population. Indeed, it is a population that is considerably older than the average in any region in Scotland, partly because it's such a lovely place to retire to and indeed to live. But the fact is that we all read of stories in the papers of elderly patients in hospitals who rely sometimes on other patients to feed them, to look after them, to ring the bell if they are in trouble. And I have no doubt at all, and many of my constituents tell me that they feel that being in a small 4-bedded ward has a considerable beneficial impact on their recuperation from whatever they're in hospital for. And I have to say that that announcement, when it was made, kicked off a very large amount of correspondence to me as the constituency member from very concerned patients. That was backed up by concerns raised by the, I think it's called the Patients Association in Scotland, which was chaired, or was certainly, by a former colleague, Dr. Jean Turner. And they certainly raised concerns about this. One of my real concerns that has been highlighted to me is that the complete lack of consultation with patients that preceding this policy that seemed to come out of fairly thin air at the time. Dr. Womersley referred to an in-house survey that was done by Dr. Chris Isles in DGRI, Dumfries Galway Royal Infirmary, which had a quite interesting outcome. In that 60% of people in wards said that if they were readmitted, they would like to stay in the wards, round about 60%. But more interestingly, 40% of the people who were in single rooms said they had a preference, if they came back into hospital, to be in a multi-bedded ward. I think that's quite significant, and I think adds weight to the concern behind this petition. I'm aware of time, Convener, so if I may just finish, I think we all sometimes get a little bit critical of consultations that seem to have a predetermined outcome. I think we've gone one step worse in this because we seem to me to have a predetermined outcome without any consultation. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Ferguson. You've actually covered the question I was going to ask about patients' views, but perhaps I could ask our two witnesses about one of the other arguments is, and you've touched on this yourselves, about infection control. There is an argument about single rooms being better for resisting hospital-acquired infections. I would be grateful for your views on this as far as why you think that's a valid point in favour or against single rooms in hospitals.
One of my own members was in single accommodation. She had at that time, terminal cancer condition. I'm glad to see it's been treatable and now she's in remission. But she contracted an infection in that situation. And I think evidence that's been coming in has pointed to a reduction overall in infection through better infection control. But I happen to feel that staff themselves, there needs to be investment in their training and to make them aware of the need at all points to wash hands in between dealing with patients.
Can I just read an extract from a note that Chris Isles, the Professor of Medicine at Dumfries Royal Infirmary, wrote? And he says, the only evidence for single rooms reducing hospital-acquired infection seems to be a Canadian study suggesting that having all rooms single prevents one case of infection per 1,818 admissions to hospital. And this assumes that isolation in a single room rather than good hand washing or some other infection control mechanism makes a difference. So the medical experts seem to be fairly convinced that the 100% argument doesn't wash, so to speak.
No pun intended. Sorry. Yeah, right. Thank you.
And if some of the budget allocation that's going into this very extravagant move towards single en-suite accommodation could be put in to further resourcing staff, training, and I believe in increasing staff numbers, I think would be a very helpful way forward.
Thank you for that. I'm bringing Chick Brodie and then Jackson Carlo.
Good morning, gentlemen. Good morning, Alec. I wonder if you can help me. In February 2007, there was an interim statement issued to the health boards based on the recommendations of the EU PHN report, saying it is appropriate to provide an overall single occupancy room level of between 50 and 100%. That was in February 2007. By November 2008, the Chief Nursing Officer issued a Chief Executive's letter saying there should be a presumption that all patients will be accommodated in single rooms. Have you any indications of why that statement was made a year and a half later? That we went from 50 to 100% in terms of occupancy rooms, single occupancy rooms, to 100%. In fact, the Chief Medical Officer's Clinical Specialities Advisor said the current provision of single-room accommodation is not sufficient across NHS Scotland, and 100% single-room provision is clinically appropriate in most clinical settings. I'm confused. Can you help?
Well, the response that I think Alex and myself got from Nicola Sturgeon at that time was the Scottish Government has undertaken considerable work about the provision of single-room accommodation and set up a steering group which reported on available literature and evidence for single rooms, a public attitude survey, a nurse staffing report and a financial impact study. The group concluded that all new build hospitals or other healthcare facilities with inpatient accommodation, there should be a presumption that all rooms should be single. And I've looked at a lot of that evidence, and I mean, they say that patients consistently voice a preference for single rooms. Well, 40% of patients do consistently voice a preference for single rooms, but on the other hand, many other people are voicing a preference for shared accommodation. So I think the evidence has kind of been interpreted in a way, but I know, and the public attitude bit, I mean, it's certainly convincing histogram here. These are the ones that prefer a single room, definitely, and these are the ones down here that inconsistently prefer one or prefer to share.
One other question associated with that, if I may. Did anyone ever ask the question, to your knowledge, as to how much the hospital would have cost if we'd had a 50% single occupancy room as opposed to having 100% single occupancy rooms?
Yeah, well, the board member, Professor Hannay, who was the Professor of General Practice before he retired and investigated this stuff, and he said that the extra cost will be 15% in capital costs and roughly the same increase in running costs and in nursing costs. Now, when I asked the board that question themselves, they said they couldn't answer the question because since there was no option but having 100% single rooms, they themselves hadn't investigated. But this one board member certainly came up with that figure.
So you're saying it would cost
about 15%
less
more to have all singles rather than a mix of singles and 4-bed bays.
No more questions.
Jackson Carlow.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning. You began, and I do want to start where you began, by illustrating some examples of patients who suffered as a result of being in single rooms. And I think the unfortunate impression might have been created that only patients in single rooms have experienced unfortunate experiences in hospitals across Scotland and the wider United Kingdom. Do you accept at first that whether it be in a room or a ward or a single room, we have all heard of patients who, because the standard of treatment or care that they received was not as it should have been, suffered as a result? And I am not aware of any example personally where the fact they were in a single room was cited specifically as the reason that they suffered.
No, I'd go along with that. That is the case.
Thank you,
yes.
because I think it's important. All private and independent hospitals have single rooms.
Right.
What's their record on health-acquired infections compared to the sector that has a variable mix?
Well, I can't answer that.
I think it's better. Where in the private independent sector, why should people in the National Health Service receive a lesser standard of care or treatment than those people who are treated within the independent sector? And where in the independent sector, where patients have been treated, has there been any evidence that they have felt that as a result of being in a single room has in some way led to them receiving an inferior level of care?
I think there's two questions. I mean, first of all, if I was in hospital, and it was for a very short, simple thing, I would much prefer to be in accommodation that was shared, and I certainly wouldn't be feeling I was getting a substandard level of treatment. And in fact, when I was a junior doctor at Rock Hill, and there were certain patients in single rooms, the nurses actually felt sorry for them because they were missing out on the camaraderie of the ward and the general healing spirit.
Well, I mean, forgive me if I think that people are in largely to be treated clinically in the first instance. And I mean, I'm interested in this concept of choice. If school children were to say that they would like to be taught in individual classrooms rather than in a collective classroom, what credence would we give to that? Surely these are decisions that are based... first of all, can I say this was debated in Parliament? So it's not that it wasn't debated. All of the political parties in this Parliament supported the move to single rooms, which was announced by the Cabinet Secretary for Health and Wellbeing at the time. What on what basis should we set aside what is thought to be the appropriate clinical direction for treatment in hospital because people would like there to be a social environment?
I don't know that it does. I mean, there are doctors at Dumfries and Galloway, and Professor Isles is certainly an eminent clinician who favour a mix of rooms because the actual medical input is one thing, but the healing environment, there's more to it than just a simple medical side.
Do you have examples, as I do, of people who have been put into a room with 3 or 4 beds with other patients who they thought to be unsuitable people to be in a room with?
So we would have a level of single rooms that would accommodate not just those that want single rooms, but those whose medical condition or behaviour or any other attributes also require them to be in a single room.
How could you do that?
Well, by moving them.
Well, how could you move them if by this time you had now not got any single rooms left because all you had were beds in rooms?
Well, you try and balance the thing. It would be like a maternity labour room. You'd one time in 3 years, you might not have insufficient beds in the labour room to accommodate all the people who are going into labour. Well, you'd have a balance done, say 50% single rooms or even 60% single rooms, so that 99 times out of 100 or 990 times out of 1,000, you could provide them with the accommodation they require.
So a final question. You see, my problem with your proposal is just all the unintended consequences of where I think it would go going forward. My most recent experience in a hospital, which was in a room with 6 beds, was that we had a convict from prison chained to the bed and permanently secured by prison guards. During the course of his time in the ward, there was an instant where, despite the length of the chain, he attacked the police officers. I thought that was a completely inappropriate environment for other patients to be in. If he'd expressed the wish to be in a room rather than a single room, should his wish be respected?
It's not. I mean,
well, then, how do you define in a list of those who can then decide whether they want to be in a single room or in a mixed room? How do you define who is entitled to make that choice? Does it become a clinical decision or a decision of the patient? If the doctor feels they should be in a single room and the patient nonetheless expresses the view that they would like to be in a room with a number of beds in it, whose will prevails in that scenario?
Well, usually the two would be in accord, but
if they're not,
where they were not in accord, well, clearly the doctor's view would prevail.
Well, exactly. And the clinical view at the moment is that we should move to single-room accommodation.
But that isn't the clinical view. There's umpteen bits of, I mean, Professor Isles and Professor Hannay are distinguished clinicians who researched all the evidence.
Well, what we've been given, I haven't seen any of the surveys that were undertaken, so it's difficult to rely upon them because we all know that these can be subjectively put as questions to individuals.
But when I carried out a 38 degrees petition, there were 200 signatories, and 40 of the signatories in favour of the petition actually wrote a substantial backing up evidence of why their preference for to share accommodation existed.
Appears to be for social reasons.
It's for healing reasons. At the end of life, there are people who don't want to die in a single room. And
yeah, I'm sorry, Jan, I'm a little bit short of time. If you don't mind, I'll maybe move on unless you had further points, Carla. It can be Angus MacDonald followed by Alec Ferguson.
Yes, thank you, Convener. Good morning, Mr Womersley. Good morning, Reverend Irving. Mr Womersley, you acknowledged in your earlier statement that over 40% of patients would prefer single rooms, as evidenced by the public attitude survey conducted by the Scottish Government in 2008, or conducted by the steering group in 2008. Now, what you didn't mention was the other figures. 22% only would prefer a multi-bedded room, and 27% didn't mind.
That's what this shows, yes.
Yeah. Now, can I just highlight to you a study that was conducted by the Health, Environment, Research and Design Journal in 2008, which concluded that single-bedded rooms are the design intervention that positively affects the largest number of outcomes in a hospital setting, especially in terms of hospital-acquired infections, improved patient sleep, privacy, patient satisfaction and communication with family members. Now, Would you not agree that that's why over 40% of patients would agree to be in a single-bedded room?
Well, I perfectly support that, and I think everyone who wants to be in a single room, there are very valid reasons, and they should have them. But I would that wouldn't be what I personally feel if I was admitted to hospital for more than a couple of days.
Okay. Okay, thanks.
Alec Ferguson.
To just very, very briefly comment on behalf of the petition, if I may, Convener, because this is not a petition that is anti-single rooms. This is a petition that is saying we ought to look at a choice, not to the extent that Jackson Carlaw was referring, that every patient gets exactly what they want. That's not the case now. Sometimes patients go into single rooms now. They might not want to. I was in a single room. I thought it was absolutely splendid, but I like my own company. A lot of people don't, which is why they probably don't want me in a multi-bedded ward. But I mean, that's by the by. But it's not a perfect system now, and it wouldn't be a perfect system as the choice. But the fact is there would be a choice, which there isn't at the moment. And I just, if I may, I think Jackson very cleverly insinuated that the petition was suggesting that somehow there was a poorer level of clinical care, both in a national health hospital and in a private hospital, but also in a single room to a multi-bedded room. That is not within this petition at all, if I may just say that.
Thanks.
Clearly, Jackson and I will have a further discussion about this in the privacy of our own corridor.
Yeah, I wouldn't intrude in family grief here. Is there any other questions that members wish to raise?
Just one question.
Chip Brody.
We heard from Jackson Carlaw about the socialisation. Isn't it a fact, with your medical experience, that in some cases, in many cases, socialisation can actually help people along the health route when they're receiving medical attention?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. Our next step, gentlemen, is just to decide on how we deal with the petition. It seemed sensible that we do ask the Scottish Government for specifics about choice. I understand there's an argument that the Scottish Government's already made its views clear, so why are we looking at that? But there is some very interesting points being raised in this petition about the role of choice. So I think it's worth looking to what extent patients are given the choice of a multi-bedroom or a single bedroom. Might be worth exploring via the Scottish Government. But again, I welcome views of the committee on that. Jackson, Carlaw?
I much support that. I think this is an opportunity for the Scottish Government some years after Parliament debated these issues to set out in writing the arguments that they see in favour of the policy, which Parliament supported.
Other colleagues? Chip Brody?
So I just, again, don't know whether it's within our remit, but I would like to find out, based on the fact that the hospital is going to cost 15% more, I just wonder if we can have some investigation as to the basis of the cost element?
Yeah, I think that's a reasonable question. I mean, again, it's perfectly competent for us to raise these points with government. It may well be government has that figures, in which case we'll get that information back. If not, we can...
I mean, what I'm saying, given the surveys, which in some cases have been disavowed, that we should have 50 to 100%, whatever it is, 50% single rooms. I just think this is an additional reason that we should ask the question that we have asked.
We'll make sure that Chip Brody's point is covered in the letter that we do to the Scottish Government. Are members of the committee happy with that course of action? Well, could I first of all thank both our witnesses for coming along today. Thank you very much for raising the issues to do with the petition, and you answered them extremely well, and I appreciate giving up your time for coming along today. I could also thank Alec Ferguson, the local member, for giving up his time to put in the points as well. Thank you very much, gentlemen, and I'll suspend for 1 minute to allow witnesses to change round. Could I continue with our meeting? The second new petition is PE 1483 by John MacLeod on bilingual version of the independence referendum question. Members have a note by the clerk. It's paper 4, the spice briefing and the petition. Can I welcome the petitioner, who is John MacLeod, and Professor Robert Demar from the University of Edinburgh. You're very welcome, gentlemen. Thank you both for coming along today. Members will be aware that Mr MacLeod and Professor Dunbar will give their evidence in Gaelic, and we have simultaneous translation facilities have been provided, and the members should wear the headphones provided to listen to the translation. If I invite Mr MacLeod to make a short presentation of around 5 minutes to set the context, after which I'll move to questions followed by my colleagues. Mr MacLeod.
Thank you. Convener and committee members, thank you for giving us this opportunity to give verbal evidence to the committee. My name is John MacLeod, and this is, as you said, Professor Robert Dunbar, Chair of Celtic Languages, Literature, History and Antiquities at the University of Edinburgh. The petition calls for the committee to urge the Scottish Government to provide a bilingual version of the Scottish independence referendum ballot paper. Although I submitted the e-petition in my name only, it was supported whilst online during the brief period. It was online by 733 signatories. The main points I would like you to consider are the following. The relevant issues are, firstly, the language rights of Gaelic speakers, and secondly, the application of existing law and language plans in relation to equality of respect. It is not about Gaelic speakers understanding English, nor is a monolingual ballot paper the normal practice in elections or referenda across the UK. The Gaelic Language Scotland Act 2005, which received all party support in the Scottish Parliament, was passed with a view to securing the status of the Gaelic language as an official language of Scotland, commanding equal respect to the English language. Both the Scottish Government and the Scottish Parliament have published Gaelic language plans which aim to ensure that when services are delivered in Gaelic, they should be of a comparable standard and quality as those provided in English. There is also a commitment to enhance the status of Gaelic by ensuring that Gaelic is given an increased profile within Scottish public life. Furthermore, both the UK and Scottish governments are signatories to the European Charter for Regional and Minority Languages, and these commitments should be respected. In my view, the use of Gaelic in a key constitutional process, such as a referendum on independence, a question the Scottish Government has said is the most important question put to a Scottish electorate in more than 300 years, is necessary in order to demonstrate the relevance of the language as an official language of Scotland. We expect that the referendum electorate will include 16 and 17-year-olds, and some of these will be products of the very successful Gaelic medium education system over the past 25 years. They deserve to have their education language given the due recognition and respect that the Act of 2005 said it should have. While I welcome the Government's promise to issue guidance on the referendum process in a bilingual format, the issue of a bilingual ballot paper is only a small step beyond that stage. The ballot paper has one short question, just 6 words only. A bilingual ballot paper may be a small step for Gaelic, but it would be a significant one, and if bilingual ballot papers can be used in Wales, why not in Scotland? Finally, I ask you to consider what message the denial of a simple bilingual ballot paper would send to the Gaelic-speaking community, and what this would signify regarding the Scottish Parliament's approach to Scotland's only official minority language.
Thank you, Mr MacLeod, for providing that opening statement. If I can kick off the first question, and obviously Professor Nabar, if you wish to come in at any time, please indicate. We're very happy to hear your views. Are you concerned that Gaelic has not been given the respect due to its statutory status as an official language in Scotland?
Certainly, if the Parliament agreed to give official language status for Gaelic, surely they thought of this at the time of the effect it would have on the language. And surely things such as elections and referendum come into the opportunities that Gaelic should have at official and public level.
Thank you for that. Can I bring my colleagues? Can I start with Angus MacDonald?
Yes, thank you, Convener. I should declare my convenership of the cross-party group on Gaelic, and also that John MacLeod has been an acquaintance of mine for a number of years, and there has been correspondence between us regarding this petition. And perhaps I should also declare that we're both Leosachs, which is the Gaelic term for people from Lewis. Martin Va, Ian Martin Va, Professor.
Good morning.
It's good to hear Gaelic being spoken in committee proceedings in Parliament once again. Now, you'll be aware that the Referendum Scotland Bill's Committee Stage 1 report, which was debated in Parliament last week, said that it was of the view that we don't consider that a persuasive case has been made for a bilingual ballot paper. One of the great virtues of the ballot paper set out in the bill is that it is simple and clear. As witnesses have pointed out, a Gaelic translation will be available to those who wish to refer to it. What do you say to those that argue that a bilingual ballot paper could cause confusion?
Well,
firstly, I would say that the pressure should not be on us to press for status for the language. Surely if official status was given to the language, if Gaelic language plans have been prepared for the language, why should we be making why should we be pushing for improvements for the language and the status of the language? Therefore, I don't think it's correct that we should ask for more from the Gaelic language community. We shouldn't ask for more from the Gaelic language community. That would be. We shouldn't ask more from the Gaelic language community than we would get from the English language community. I don't think that with this type of paper that it would confuse anybody at all, or that it would cause confusion in anybody's minds, in the voters' minds. It is a very simple paper. There is only 6 words, one question with 6 words. It is not a long paper with lots of writing or anything like that. The question is simple, and just as they do in Wales, half the paper could be in English, half could be in Gaelic, and there could just be 2 boxes for the choice. We do not ask anyone to write anything on the ballot paper apart from putting X in one box. I think this is an example of the type of voting paper where we should start from, where we should start giving equality for Gaelic. It will be a very simple paper, and it should not cause any problems for the voters.
Mr. DeBar.
Thank you very much, and thank you for this opportunity to be here today and give evidence through the medium of Gaelic. That in itself is a very important thing for Gaelic, and we're very grateful for that opportunity. regarding whether people would be confused, as Ian said, bilingual voting papers have been used in Wales in different referenda throughout the years, and also in Ireland they use bilingual voting papers in referendums. I'm originally from Canada, and again in some of the states such as Quebec, people are used to using bilingual voting papers. Although there are more Welsh speakers and more Irish speakers than there are Gaelic speakers in Scotland, some people in Ireland and in Wales and in Quebec are more than able to speak both languages. Some are able to speak one language but maybe not be able to read in another language, and in many ways those countries have similar situations to Scotland, and there is no evidence from these countries that people are confused by having bilingual voting paper, especially if it is a simple question. There is evidence from these countries about what the paper would look like, and I don't think there would be any problem at all with this. Also, the Electoral Commission could take a look at this, especially if this came from the Parliament, if the Parliament thought that this would cause any difficulty.
For that, Angus MacDonald.
Convener, you both have mentioned now that the fact that the ballot paper for the Welsh referendum on extending the powers of the Welsh Assembly was a bilingual ballot paper. Presumably you've brought that to the attention of the Scottish Government and the committee in your submissions. And also, I believe, Arthur Cormack, who submitted comments to the committee, did provide a sample of how the ballot paper could look. I do note in your submission to the Petition Committee that the opportunity would be taken to bring the absence of a bilingual ballot paper in the referendum to the attention of the Council of Europe Committee of Experts, who at their meeting on the 1st of May this year would be taking evidence from Gaelic organisations as to the Scottish Government's progress on meeting their obligations under the European Charter for regional or minority languages. Can you tell us how that went, and did you highlight the issue of the bilingual ballot paper at that meeting?
Unfortunately, I didn't have the opportunity to give evidence at that meeting, so I couldn't say whether the issue was discussed or not. I wasn't there either. Rob wasn't there either, so we can't answer that question.
Okay, perhaps you could get back to us with some more information on that. Convener, with your indulgence, obviously, as we've already stated, the Stage 1 debate took place last week, where it was pointed out that no Gaelic speaker is monolingual. However, it was also acknowledged that equal respect for Gaelic, as set out in the 2005 Act, needs to be addressed in future by this Parliament, independent or not. However, it was pointed out during the debate that no attempt was made by petitioners to have bilingual ballot papers in the 2007 and 2011 Scottish Government elections, the 2010 UK election, or the alternative vote referendum. Had any consideration been given to petitioning for a bilingual ballot paper at any of these elections?
As far as I know, no such effort was made. And I think it would be correct to say that it was seen as a problem, being a problem at the time, with too much information being on the voting papers. I remember at one of the elections that there was a complaint that how long the ballot paper was, and that would cause problems for voters. But when I saw this opportunity, I saw that it was an opportunity to start up this initiative, since it was going to be a very simple voting paper, a very simple and short voting paper, which will be used next year. And then so I've never seen a situation up till now where we could have the opportunity to have equality for Gaelic in the voting system.
The procedure still hasn't been completed. We still have to go through stage 2 and stage 3 of the bill, so that there may be an opportunity for members to bring forward amendments at stage 2. So I'm sure you'll be watching proceedings with interest.
Professor Navarre?
I was just going to say that referenda are slightly different from normal elections. In every constituency, the voting papers are different. And I think it would be worth for Bórna Gaelic to think about the use of Gaelic in official forums at election time. That is a very important thing to raise the profile and image of Gaelic. And that is at the very heart of the philosophy of the Gaelic Language Act, to promote Gaelic in different situations, different from the normal situations in which Gaelic speakers use the language. With that, I think this is a very important part of that. Up till now, there has been no discussion of this, and I think that different views will be raised on whether there will be bilingual voting papers should be used in elections in the Western Isles, for example. And I think there are problems associated with that. But this is a different situation where there's just one voting paper for the whole country. And in that respect, this election or this vote is different. This is recognised in Ireland, for example. Although they use bilingual voting papers in some elections, there is a special act which was agreed by the Irish Parliament regarding referendum. And they have it in law that referenda should have bilingual voting papers. In that sense, I would encourage this Parliament, Bórna Gaelic, and other groups to look very closely at this proposal. But at this particular election, this referendum is very different from other normal elections.
Thank you. Thank you for that.
I'm sure Bórna Gaelic have taken on board the facts that have been raised in this debate, and in fact I'm meeting with them, with the Chief Executive tomorrow, so I'll certainly take that opportunity to raise the points that you raised today.
Thank you for that. I'm a little bit short of time, so just could members indicate if they wish to ask any questions? John Wilson.
Good morning.
You've indicated, Professor Dunbar, at the end of your last contribution there, the importance of this referendum means that you would like to see the simultaneous language being used, the Gaelic and the English, in all ballot papers. Would you not wish to see that being extended to other elections in the future? Because this could be a precedent for other elections. If you're serious about promoting the Gaelic language, and one of the ways to promote the Gaelic language is every 4 or 5 years at an election, rather than just a referendum.
Certainly. I think that would be a very good opportunity. It's amazing. I'm sure people will be discussing this question through the medium of Gaelic. Both sides from in the referendum campaign have created paper information in the Gaelic language. Blogs talk about whether Scotland should be an independent country through the medium of Gaelic. Gaelic media media discuss the issue very closely, and certainly people will be discussing this question through the medium of Gaelic. And that is a great thing. It's very good that people are able to do this. And it's strange in a way that the government have issued papers through the medium of Gaelic, communication papers through the medium of Gaelic about this issue. And then we can discuss the issue, we can analyse the issue, we can get information from the media through the medium of Gaelic. But when we come to the little, when we go to vote to tick the box that we want, we will not be able to do this through the medium of Gaelic, and I find that a little bit strange. But from now on, I also think we should look at the use of language in important aspects of life, such as general elections. I would say this is an opportunity for a test to test out this question as a pilot in a way. If it works, that would be great. If any problems arise, we will learn from them, we will learn, improve from this for the future. But maybe many of these questions were raised when we started Gaelic medium education. People had worries whether it was appropriate for children to be taught through the medium of Gaelic rather than through the medium of English. We've got past those problems. Gaelic medium education has been going for 25 years now, and it has been highly successful, and nobody says that it's not appropriate for children to be learning through the medium of Gaelic. And there have been great benefits associated with Gaelic medium education. And I think we can see that as an example of the use of Gaelic in appropriate settings, in public and private settings, and we're moving bit by bit to getting increased profile for the language, and doesn't harm English speakers in any way at all.
John Wilson.
Could you indicate whether or not you've had any discussions with either the Electoral Commission, Electoral Management Board or local returning officers about the practicalities of including Gaelic on the ballot paper?
We haven't had any discussions with any of these groups. I don't think it's appropriate for me to go forward with that at this moment. I don't think there should be any problem with the paper, with a short question and short paper, 6 words in the question. I don't think we should be looking, we should be expecting any problems.
Mr. McClary, you indicated earlier that you recognise the importance of this referendum, and what you did say is that we could learn from any problems that may arise during the referendum in terms of use of the Gaelic language. Would you not agree that we need to be quite clear, as a major decision that the Scottish people are being asked to take a year from tomorrow, that we should make the ballot paper as clear as possible so that there's no ambiguity about how people are going to vote in that referendum?
I agree that the ballot paper must be simple and easy to understand. And again, I have got a draft of a paper prepared here, where the English is on one side, is on one half of the paper, and where the Gaelic is on the other half. And there's one box to agree for, to say yes, and one box to say no. I don't think that's too difficult to understand. As Rob said, that type of paper is used in Ireland, Wales, and in other countries without any problems. And I think we have to overcome the opinion that everything has to be in English so that people can understand it. It is a very important question, point, and I think there are ways around to solve this, and I think it would be appropriate to bring in the Electoral Commission to this. When the Scottish Government asked the Electoral Commission the question, they didn't ask them, they didn't give them an example of a bilingual voting paper. They just asked whether they just asked whether the bilingual paper would be a problem for anyone, or whether indeed a one language paper would cause problems for anyone. And I think it would be sensible to put the question back to the Electoral Commission, the Commission which has the powers to deal with this type of question. And I think other types of questions as well have been raised and have come up about this vote. Some things that are very different. For example, for the first time, 16 and 17-year-olds will have the chance to vote. That is a new thing as well. Perhaps there will be problems with that as well. Although that, however, that was discussed, and I'm sure we'll be able to deal with those problems. And I'm sure those problems can be solved and made easier. And I think it would be sensible as well to allow the Electoral Commission to discuss this question and perhaps test the bilingual paper and to see if there would be more questions, more problems with the bilingual paper. In a reply that Ian MacLeod got from the Scottish Government thought there may be problems associated with this. They spoke to some of the returning officers, and I'm not sure there's very much evidence for that, and I believe that it would be better to allow the Electoral Commission to have a look at this question, and if lots of problems do arise from the testing, it would be important for the Electoral Commission to deal with that then. But as John MacLeod said, lots of other countries do use bilingual referendum voting papers, and I'm sure Scottish people are just as intelligent as Irish people and Welsh people, and I think it would be very important to allow the Electoral Commission to run a test of a bilingual voting paper.
Stage 2 of this debate will be very interesting in the Chamber, or stage 3 will be interesting. I think committee stage 2 will be very interesting in terms of the pursuance of this argument. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, John Wilson. I'm afraid we're out of time, so it's now for the committee to look at the next steps. I think we've all agreed it's a very interesting petition. Yep. However, as we've already heard, I think, from Angus MacDonald, there is we've already been through stage 1, and there is opportunity at stage 2 for individual members to raise amendments. So there is a practical constraint on what we can do because we've got active Scottish Government proposals going ahead. Nevertheless, I'd like to hear the views of members on next steps.
I would agree, Convener, that there's very little more that this Petitions Committee could do. However, as I did mention earlier, there is the opportunity, as John Wilson has also mentioned, for amendments to come forward at stage 2 or stage 3, and that's probably the best way forward for this situation.
Thank you for that, John Wilson.
Could I suggest, Convener, that we, as a committee, take the opportunity to write to the Scottish Government to indicate that we've had this petition before us and we are considering this petition. We are aware in terms of the legislative programme and we've now moved on to stage 2, but could I also suggest we write to the Electoral Commission and the Electoral Management Board for Scotland to ask them their views on whether or not the use of Gaelic in a ballot paper would cause or perceived to cause any issues in relation to distribution of ballot papers for the referendum next year.
I certainly think it's certainly competent for us to write to the Electoral Commission. The clerk points out, I think the Deputy First Minister had some discussions with the Electoral Commission on that, and we've got some information about that. But I don't see that being in conflict with the issue that this isn't before Parliament. So in terms of competence, John Wilson's point is valid. Can I ask other members for their views if they support John Wilson's proposals? Yeah. Are members all content? Thank you for that. So as you can hear, we are going to continue with the petition to write to the Scottish Government to get their views. I think there was some very interesting points that you both raised. Can thank you both for coming along and giving evidence to the committee today. We will keep you up to date with developments, and thank you very much for giving up your time to come before this committee today, and I'll suspend for 1 minute to allow witnesses to change round. Thank you all. Restart our committee. We're in the third new petition today is PE 1480 by Amanda Capel on behalf of the Frank Capel Alzheimer's Awareness Campaign on Alzheimer's and Dementia Awareness. Members are note by the clerk at the spice briefing on the petition. Could I welcome the petitioner? You're very welcome. Thank you for coming along. And of course Dr. Susan Logie, who's a consultant in old age psychiatry, and can invite Mrs. Capel to make a short presentation of around 5 minutes. And we also have Graham Day, who's here supporting the petition. And Mr. Day, feel free to intervene and make any questions you wish when we're going through questions. Mrs. Capel.
Good morning, and thank you very much for allowing me to speak to you today. Ladies and gentlemen, I have lost my husband, even though he is still living. A tough subject, Alzheimer's and dementia. These two words bring fear to the heart of so many people. The ones who are living with it, a true hell on earth, and the family of those who suffer. The family who try to bring back the person they knew and loved. We lose them before they die. My husband Frankie was a professional footballer, starting his career in 1964 as a young 14-and-a-half-year-old apprentice at Manchester United. He went on to play for Blackburn Rovers, then Dundee United, joined Arbroath and finally became assistant manager at Forfar Athletic. And unlike the footballers of today, he did not earn the enormous amounts of wages that they do nowadays. When his football career ended in 1983, he continued in full-time employment up until a few years ago. He was diagnosed with vascular dementia the week before his 60th birthday. At that point, he was a very fit, active man. He turned 64 in March of this year. This man now, when asked, does not even know how to sit down, never mind kick a ball. Every day is a constant battle. A battle which Frankie is never going to win with his progressive terminal illness. But it is also a constant battle for me with officials and red tape, and one which I hope after today will change. The disease behaves differently in each person's body. The disease is no respecter of age, creed or colour, or how much money you have in your bank account. Frankie did not ask to be diagnosed with dementia, but I find him being discriminated against by having to pay for personal care because he is under 65. Free personal and nursing care was introduced in Scotland in July 2002 for people over 65. We pay almost £350 per month for his personal care. To have 45 minutes input each day, This is to give him a shower in the morning and also get him ready for bed at night. I would love to have been able to continue to carry out my husband's personal care, but his dementia has progressed to the point that this is no longer possible. It should not matter whether someone is 55 or 75. All personal care should be free in Scotland to all people with dementia when they are assessed as needing it, regardless of the figure on their birth certificate. I, like others in my situation, are asking, begging and pleading for change. Change to enable us to live what precious time we have left together to the full. Change so that I don't have to make the choices, for instance. Do I take Frank out for a run in the car, which he enjoys, for a coffee and a cake, or to buy a Kylie so that he does not lie on a urine-soaked bed? Change to make sure that our loved ones' human dignity and safety is not compromised. Free personal care for people with dementia under the age of 65 needs to be reviewed urgently. No one under 65 with dementia should be discriminated against. I know, ladies and gentlemen, I am not the only one who has lost a loved one to this awful disease. I need to know that I have done everything in my power to ensure that Frankie has the best quality of life possible. I also know that I cannot make the relevant changes, but I know that you can. And I would ask you now to please start making those changes today. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Bell, for that very moving account of your family circumstance. You, I think, touched on my question, which was, it seemed to me that the key issue was about extending free personal care to dementia sufferers to any age, not just 65. Is that the key, you believe, in your petition?
Yes, it's under 65. I would like, what does it matter? It's the same illness. It's the same disease, whether you're 65 or 66 or 76 or 45, 46, But the under 65s have to pay for free personal care. For personal care. Over 65s don't. And I think as well too, because there are a lot more younger people being diagnosed with it now under 65, I think Dr. Logie will agree with me that some of them are not reaching 65 because of what's happening in their brain. They have a very strong body, but the brain is rapidly, dying. Now, as I say, dementia has come to our door. I would have been one of these people 7, 8, 9 years ago that thought it was only an elderly person's disease. It has come to our door, and it is a horrible disease. And as I say, I really do feel that it's, under 65s are being discriminated against because of their age.
And do you feel that the public have any awareness of the huge problems created by dementia, particularly as we're all hopefully growing older and there's greater problems in the future? And I know Dr. Logie might want to say something on that as well.
I feel maybe since we started the campaign, because of my husband's profile, it can happen to anybody. It can happen to anybody. And I think, yes, I think there is a lot of awareness now about dementia. And yes, you're right that, a lot of people are, we're living longer than that. Unfortunately, the under 65s, some of them are not being afforded that. They will be dead before they're 65, so they won't even get their free personal care.
Thank you for that. Dr. Lee, on the issue of under 65, I think probably the general public will have a general awareness as you grow older there's a greater chance of dementia, but perhaps don't understand the issue of under 65s. Are the number of patients under 65 with dementia growing in Scotland?
I don't know if they're growing. I think there's probably more awareness. I think the Scottish Government figure is about 2,500 people with dementia under 65 in Scotland. about 200 people a year are diagnosed with it. And it covers, you know, a wide variety of different illnesses, actually. And I think people under 65, sometimes it takes longer to get the diagnosis because it's a much rarer condition. So they might be present as having depression, or they might see a neurologist, and sometimes it can take quite a long time for them to be diagnosed. I think it's also a particularly difficult financial situation that people under 65 with dementia have. It's often a very insidious illness, so there may have been years where they were underperforming at work, or maybe not paying their tax, or, you know, if they run their own business, they're running into financial difficulties because they're not performing as well as they usually would. They may have mortgages, they may have school-aged children, they may have elderly relatives themselves, and, you know, they're not someone who's reached pension age and has been able to save up for their old age. These are often people in the sort of prime of life, really, who would be expecting to be at their highest earning capacity, and they develop these illnesses. So in my experience, they are people who struggle more financially even than people over 65.
I suppose a very difficult question. How do you define the number of people undiagnosed? By definition is almost an impossible thing to say, but and it may be even experienced GPs don't pick up necessarily that, you know, a 30-year-old is suffering from dementia. I mean, that must be a real issue in our health service in Scotland.
I think that's right. I mean, more often it's middle-aged people. So we're more often, I think 2/3 of people would be with the diagnosis of dementia under 65 would be over 55. So it's more often, but it is people that might turn up looking like they might have stress-related memory difficulties or depression, or women might be misdiagnosed as having menopausal problems. And even with the best will in the world, it can take a while to diagnose, because the diagnosis is about global cognitive deterioration over at least 6 months. So you really need that history of things deteriorating over a considerable period of time before you can make the diagnosis. Currently, anyway.
Right. And so, I mean, is it very categoric, the diagnosis? Do you need to use brain scan technology, or what's the...
You would usually do some detailed neuropsychological testing on someone of that age, so probably a psychologist would see them and look at their performance across different areas of the brain, and there would be scanning. Again, with people that age, they may need more intensive investigations to exclude other causes, so they may need a neurologist to see them. So it is actually quite a difficult diagnosis to make often.
Thank you for that. Graham, do you wish any points at this stage?
Well, I think the points have been very well made. I would be interested in exploring how, beyond the issue of free personal care, how geared up the health service actually is to cope with this group of people.
I think often this group of people are looked after by old age psychiatry, which I suppose kind of makes the case about, in that way, perhaps slightly awkwardly, these younger people are looked after by old age psychiatry services, mostly in Scotland. They will be like our service, where we look after everybody over 65 with any mental health issue and people under 65 with dementia. So they're sort of slightly awkwardly put in with older people in that sense, and yet in some other ways they're not getting the free personal care that other people we look after are. So, and I think there are often people who are fitter, they're more active, at least in the beginnings of the illness. They may have completely different tastes to people, you know, the difference between someone 55 and 85 and what kind of music they like to listen to. So, especially I think in some rural areas like Angus, it's very difficult to organise specific services for this small group of people, which are also local enough to be accessible to people, and that's always the tension that you have in a rural area. I think in the cities it's probably a bit easier to organise specific services or specific daycare.
Okay, then Jackson Carlo.
Thank you. Good morning. Just on that last point, Dr. Logie, there are 3,200 sufferers under the age of 65. You used 2,000.
I think
2,000.
Yeah.
Localisation. I mean, across Scotland, is there a predominance of this problem in any one area? Is it in the cities or rural areas or West Coast, East Coast?
Not to my knowledge. Not to my knowledge. I think in the west of Scotland there is more alcohol-related brain damage, alcohol-related type dementia, but I'm not aware of any major differences between the different areas.
And I wonder if, Mrs. Cabell, if you said in the petition there are other uphill battles faced by families. Sometimes these battles are with the DWP and health authorities. Could you expand upon that, please?
Yes. When Frankie was first diagnosed, and our doctor, our GP, said to us, right, Amanda, you know, you have to now apply for benefits and that, because Frankie was going to be losing his job. And, you know, never having done that before for him, anyway, did it. And I remember the doctor saying that day to me, Amanda, once you get everything in place and that, you can concentrate on Frankie, because this is going to be a very difficult road for you. Now, the first gentleman who came to see us that day, I remember it. I mean, looking back on it, he became quite good friends with us, but he walked in and he said, I'm not going to shake your hand, Frank, because you're an Arab. And I was going to say, well, you will know exactly then. And it was, I mean, it was, you know, it was obviously broke the ice a bit about it. But he started to complete the form, and he said, and his words were, well, I don't think you'll get anything, Frank, because you look all right. Now, that was the first step that, you know, that we went.
DWP?
The actual job centre who had brought the DWP forum. He did come back later on, 6-7 months later, and Frankie had started to deteriorate by that time. And he said then, right, you will be able, you know, to claim something. And he said, my father had dementia, to which I replied, well, you should have known then, you know, 6 months ago. If you knew that 6 months ago, you know, you shouldn't have made a remark like that. I have had 5 years of constant battles with DWP, forum filling, people, I suppose, being, you know, going through the rigmarole of someone on the other end of the phone saying, can he do this? Can he do that? Could he go on a bus? And I'm telling him, no, my husband is dying in front of my eyes. He cannot do this. And then the final word, I wished I had £1 for every time someone said to me, as I'm going off the phone, I hope he gets better soon. Now, in an ideal world, I would love for the minute someone phones up these departments, the minute someone says, I have a husband who has dementia, who has Alzheimer's, right, Mrs. Cabell, I'll put you on to someone who understands what you're talking about. Because I don't want to be here. Yes, I would love my husband to improve. It's never going to happen. But I think as well to, as I say, I'm still, I know the DWP, I know that the government are trying to sort out the benefit system, to make it simpler for people. But all my energy in that goes into looking after Frankie. I shouldn't...
What help are you getting?
What help am I getting? Well, I have the support worker coming in from Alzheimer's Scotland, and she's very good, isn't she, Mrs. Broadley? I have good family and friends. Frankie goes to daycare to give me a wee bit of respite, 5 mornings a week, usually from 10 o'clock to 1 o'clock. But I was told last week that they're because he is deteriorating, because they're not dementia status, they're struggling now to cope with him. So the daycare that he's gone to for the last year and a bit, he's now going to have to go to somewhere. And as Dr. Logie said, the only really places that Frankie can go, the age groups are late 70s, 80s and 90s. You know, because I feel there's not the facilities for the under 65s. Frank and I have been married nearly 45 years next year. We grew up as children. We've been together actually 50 years since the first day. It's a lifetime. I want to do the best I can for him. And if it means keeping him at home until he passes away, that's what I want. And I would like to keep him at home, not to put him in a nursing home where he won't get the care that I will give him. I get £3.81 a day carer's allowance from the DWP for looking after my husband. And that is because I'm now 63 and I get my small state pension. I don't get the full state married women's state pension. So I get £42 odds a week from the government. But because of the rules and regulations, and I understand that, I didn't pay enough big stamps in my working life. Because I did that, I'm not allowed to claim the full carer's allowance. So I get £3.81 per day, which is insulting, absolutely insulting. And we have a mortgage to pay. We still have a mortgage to pay. We pay gas, electricity, because of Frankie's condition. You know, normally our heating is on, even in the summertime. It's on even low. These bills are going up. We still have to have a phone. And because his dementia is changing, his taste buds and that are changing. We still have to have our insurance, wear and tear on things, I mean, things that add up, like the mattress protectors and that. We have to have 2 or 3 of these, the duvets, the blankets, because he's now doubly incontinent. He can, when he gets up during the night, he can go from bed to bed. You know, if he's maybe soaked the bed, I have to put him into another bed and that. It is very stressful for me, but I love this man to bits.
Thank you.
I think that, very sort of vivid comment and very distressing comment on the finance side, it must add so much extra pressure to you. And you're,
Can I tell you as well too, for instance, the forums a few years ago, they came and said, oh, Frankie, you're allowed working tax credit. And I said, right, okay then, so we filled in the forum and that, blah, blah, blah. Working tax credit, and then I think it was 18 months ago, they then came and said, no, actually you have to repay it, nearly £4,000, because we made an error here. You should have actually gone on to pension credit. And even up to 2 weeks ago, they are still hounding my husband for this overpayment. And it's been pointed out by our solicitor, who is trying to fight it. I mean, I did start to pay some of it back, but obviously expenses and everything, are just getting on top of us. But I mean, our solicitor had actually tried to argue with them that if they had given us the right information the first time, they would have put Frankie onto pension credit, so that the actual amount to the state, if they had, stopped it, would have just been in the hundreds, which would have been repayable. But, if you've never been in that position before, you don't know. It's like anything in life, you don't know.
It may well be one for your local MSP or MP to take up. I mean, maybe you're already dealing with that. I would certainly recommend you do that if you want.
Yes, thank you. I think as well too, 3 months ago, I know they had to do it, but Atos, I don't know how you pronounce it, they then sent a letter, and quite a brief letter really, but just to say that, one of Frankie's benefits would be, stopped, unless we could provide them with the details, about how bad he was, basically, and come through to a tribunal in Edinburgh to get him back to work.
Again, I'm sure you're looking at some advice from elected members, I would certainly recommend you have a look at that.
I think I'm trying to make the point that these are all stressful situations. I shouldn't have to be battling that. My husband is not only in this battle, but I'm battling for him. And when these other things are coming in day by day, and they are coming in once a week sort of thing, you know, it's taken away the care that I want to provide for my husband.
Thank you for that. Jackson Carlow.
Yes, thank you for bringing a petition to us this morning, because I think you've identified an area which I think you have very ably demonstrated is overlooked currently within the system. Your experience, sadly, is going to be one that ever more Scots are going to be facing. We all understand that. It's no longer something that's set to happen in the future. It is happening across Scotland to families everywhere now, and indeed it might not be an exaggeration to say that at some point every family will have a direct rather than indirect experience of it. I think, in fact, Alzheimer's Scotland estimate it's 3,200 so, under the age. And I think, as you said, Dr. Logie, the emerging group is very often people in their late 40s who may well be substance abuse recoverers of some sort, for whom an unexpected consequence at an earlier stage in life than we might have anticipated is the onset of dementia. I'm interested, I mean, I think this is certainly a matter that will be pursued. I can't presume the view of the committee, but I'm interested, I think you have partly answered this. Given that clinicians say that there is nothing in the immediate horizon, and I, as health spokesman for my own party, regularly meet and ask, and it's always 15 years away whenever I ask, and I asked 7 years ago and it was 15 years away then, it's 15 years away now. Some major breakthroughs that were anticipated had to be withdrawn at the last minute because unforeseen consequences were found with the treatment that everybody thought might be a breakthrough treatment, and it's a long, slow process. But I'm interested, Mrs. Capel, in your experience, given that more families are going to have this to face, is the education, training and preparedness for families pretty inadequate in your view at the present time? Does there need to be, over and above the direct nature of your petition, which is to provide support to those people who are under the age of 65, is there something more fundamental that needs to be looked at in terms of the early understanding of families who will have to face this, as to a kind of comprehensive guidance as to what they might need to do and how they might need to access it?
Definitely. I think there has to be more education and, you know, and awareness. Definitely. I was asked to speak up at the Royal College of Nursing earlier this year in a dementia conference, just to actually say, you know, what it was like from a younger person's point of view with dementia. And it was amazing the feedback that I got from the delegates there, who they said they learnt quite a bit when I told them our story. I feel Alzheimer's and dementia has been, you know, I know that it's now getting mentioned more often, but I think it has to be, you know, more of a priority now for all over the board to educate people about it. Even like say in schools and like that, because these younger people now are possibly the future of the dementia, you know, sufferers in the future, sort of thing.
Thank you.
Unfortunately, I'm a little bit short of time. Do any members who wish to indicate? Could I just ask you to hold on for a few minutes, because we're looking at the next steps of the petition. I think we all agree it's been a very sort of moving example of Mrs. Cabell's situation with her husband. I think certainly we would like to contact the Scottish Government and ask them the views on the petition. It might be as well, I think, clarifying the issue about whether there's any moves towards reducing the age of free personal care. I think the government's made some statements in the past, but it might be worth getting some clarity, because Mrs. Capel made the point this is the absolute vital aspect in care, and of course getting the views of Alzheimer's Scotland and other groups as well. But what are the views of the committee members? Are they agreeable in that course of events? Jackson Carlow?
Yes, I am, convener. I mean, I think this is a growing group, but I don't think it will be an alarmingly unmanageable growing group that could not be accommodated within the system. But the other slight thing that came out there, I think, is that given that we have a devolved Parliament and still have some matters reserved to Westminster, I would be interested to know what liaison there is between the two in trying to pull together the necessary advice that Alzheimer's sufferers have access to. And in the first instance, I might be interested in what the Scottish Government's view of that is, because it may well be that we're making it harder than it needs to be because of the political process that we have agreed be in place. And I think that would be most unfortunate and something that we ought to be able to correct if we were to approach it. And it would be a unique situation to the devolved administrations rather than one in England and Wales, where, of course, they would be under the control of single entities.
Right. Members agree with that course of action? Any other points of action that members wish to raise that we haven't covered? Well, as you've heard, we're obviously very enthusiastic about pursuing your petition. So we are going to write to the Scottish Government and a number of other agencies, and obviously we'll keep you up to date with developments. Thanks, Ms. Cabell, particularly for coming along. I know it must have been very difficult today, explaining your very difficult family circumstances, yes. And I'm sure all the committee would put regards to your husband.
Thank you.
And thank you, Dr. Logie and Graham Day as well for coming along. And I suspend for 1 minute to allow our witnesses to leave. Thank you very much.
Suspended.
Sorry, I'm suspended. Right. What did you all in place? Can I resume? Thank you very much. We're on agenda item 3, consideration of current petitions. It's PE 1098 by Lynn Merrifield on behalf of Kingseat Community Council and PE 1223 by Ron Beattie on school bus safety. I think we've also got Stuart Stevenson's got an interest in the petition. Members have a note by the clerk and the submissions. Perhaps I could ask Stuart Stevenson if he would like to make a very brief submission to the committee.
Yes, Convener. I would just like to make the rather obvious point that this remains as important and urgent an issue as it was when it was first raised in the Parliament, and perhaps to observe that there is progress being made elsewhere, in particular in August, third week of August. York Council, for example, south of the border, decided to change its contract for school buses to require all of them to have seat belts. So I think, that I think is a contribution to the discussion on the subject of school bus safety, which is of course not simply about seat belts, but also about branding and so on and so forth external to the bus. So I'm simply here, Convener, to encourage you to keep up the pressure on this issue. It remains as important, not simply for the petitioners and my constituents, but for people right across Scotland. And I hope that my presence here ensures that we continue to keep this in the agenda and progress it in a vigorous way.
And I know you've had some passing involvement with transport in your past life, Mr. Stevenson, as well, so it's very good to have you along today. I think one of the issues we looked at on this was, I think we were promised some Scottish Government report to be completed by the end of June. I'm conscious we don't think we've had that yet. I mean, obviously, I'll throw it open to members for contributions. I think it is a very important, or they're both very important petitions. It seemed to me to be sensible we may invite Keith Brown to come along at a future meeting, but I wanted again to ask the views of committee members before proceeding. Chip Brodie?
Yes, but, and I've raised this issue elsewhere. For the life of me, I still do not understand why this cannot be progressed or has not been progressed much more quickly. I mean, I know there are some ramifications in terms of Westminster decision-making, but I do not, for the life of me, understand why this is taking so long.
Okay, thank you. Other colleagues? Are colleagues satisfied that we continue this petition and invite Keith Brown to come before us in a future meeting? Well agreed. Thank you very much. I think you would note our interest, Mr. Seamson, in this interesting petitions. So we'll have Keith Brown at a future meeting, and you may wish to come back and speak at that meeting as well. You'd be very welcome if you wish to do that.
Thank you very much, Convener, and I would certainly want to try and schedule that. And I hope you recognise the continuing commitment of Ron Beattie, who once again is here with us to show his continuing commitment to this petition. Something which, you know, involves travelling from the north of Scotland on a regular basis at his own expense. So I think he is by no means the only person to whom this matters, but his commitment to this is very substantial indeed.
I'm sure the committee will want to extend our thanks to Mr. Beattie in the gallery for coming along today and giving up his time. Thank you very much. The next petition is PE 1439 by Jonathan McCall on betting and loan shops in deprived communities. Again, members have a note and submissions. Again, my own view was I thought this was a very novel and very interesting petition. I think we have had quite an interesting discussion on it. There is some of the issues which are reserved, and the Scottish Government, I think, has made a very clear issue on it in terms of its role in planning. I unfortunately couldn't see any further work that this committee could carry out, but again, I'm always open to thoughts and ideas from other committee members to see how we could proceed. My initial thoughts were that, unfortunately, we would need to close this because I couldn't see any further action, but again, can I ask committee members for their views? Is silent as assent? Are members agreeable then that we closing the petition on the basis that we've come to the end of the road in fruitful work we can do? But I would like to place on record my thanks to the petitioner. I think this is a very, very interesting petition indeed, and I would have liked personally to see what more we could have done, but unfortunately I can't see any further scope for work by this committee. If I can move on to next petitions, PE 1441 by David Crichton on flood insurance problems. Members of the note by the clerk and submissions. Again, members will recall that we had Mr. Crichton here give evidence to us, and we had a debate in Parliament, which a number of members contributed to. You recall that the issue was that the UK government basically needs to underwrite the insurance firms that are protecting individuals who are building on, say, flood areas. My understanding is from the UK government is that they've now agreed a scheme called Flood Re, that's just RE. But this may take a couple of years before this is fully implemented because there's European state aid rules that have to be clarified, and that involves discussions with the European community or the EU. So I think this again has been a very, very interesting petition. Things that seem to have moved on. But it seems to me it probably makes sense to refer this to Rule 4's Climate Change and Environment Committee under Rule 15.6.2. Angus MacDonald.
Convener, the Rural Affairs and Environment Committee has scheduled flooding into its work programme for the next few months, so it would certainly be a good opportunity to refer this petition on.
Are members agreeable to that course of action?
Agreed.
I did have some,
sorry, Chuck Roddy.
As a debate in your absence, wrote to the Minister just as an aide-memoire, and I know he's pursuing it with Westminster, but I sincerely hope that we can bring forward the activities of Flood Re, which the government and ABI are discussing, the Westminster government.
Clearly there's a much wider issue around about climate change, which is beyond the scope of our discussions today, but certainly it's one I think we're all very, very worried about for the future.
I think it's also one that we discussed that I sincerely hope that we will not end up, as we found in the course of the debate, subsidising to the extent we were some areas that are more severely affected.
Thank you for that. Are members agreeable with that course of action? Thank you for that. Can I move to our next petition? It's PE 1443 by Maureen Sharkley on behalf of Scottish Care Information and Miscarriage and investigating the cause of miscarriage. Members of a note by the clerk and the submissions. Again, I think this was an excellent petition, which seems to me we've tried to touch every base with this. the Scottish Government has stated its clear support for the current Royal College guidelines, and the organisations as a whole don't seem to support the investigation in terms of testing for women, which is as unfortunate because the petitioner, I think, makes some very good points. But we obviously just have to go with the evidence that's before us. So, again, unfortunately, I don't see any other action other than to close. But again, I'm open to persuasion from other members of the committee. John Wilson.
Thank you. Could I suggest we write to the Royal College of General Practitioners again and ask them about their patient-centred care objectives that they've clearly outlined in their response, but take it further and ask, they make reference to the e-learning module on their website covering early pregnancy loss, which is free to members to access. Could I suggest we write to the Royal College and ask how many GPs do access that e-learning module, and how whether or not there have been any issues raised in relation to the number of GPs taking up the opportunity, because it's fine to say it's like having a leaflet in a surgery, doctor's surgery, but you can only get the information if you actually read the leaflet. I would like to know how many GPs are actually participating in this module, and how many have been and how many are participating in this module, so that we can actually get some indication as to the take-up by GPs. But as I said, Convener, my opening comment on this one was the patient-centred care, and how the Royal College of General Practitioners measures the patient-centred care in relation to the patient's request to a GP or to a consultant for testing, for early testing in relation to miscarriage, may conflict, and in my view, may conflict with the patient-centred care philosophy that the Royal College claims to have within the response they gave us.
Thank you for that. Are members agreeable?
Agreed.
Okay, thank you for that. I'll move then to PE 1448 by Grant Thompson on improving awareness of the cancer risks in organ transplantation. Members have a note by the clerk and submissions. Invite contributions from members.
I think we should close it on the basis of, as the position says, that the 3 transplant units in Scotland, the Newcastle unit, have implemented the group's recommendations.
Are members agreeable? Thank you for that. The next petition is PE 1454 by Natalie Robb on hyperemesis specialist nurses. Members have a note by the clerk and submissions. Again, I note that the Scottish Government are setting up a Scottish hyperemesis network to be set up, and new guidelines are to be commissioned. Again, I think this was a very thoughtful petition. I think we've pushed this as far as we possibly can and hopefully got some sort of result here. Are members agreeable then on that basis that we can close the petition? Yep. Is everyone agreed? Thank you for that. Next one is PE 1465 by Tony Ivanov on maintenance of vacant lands and private ownership. Members have a note by the clerk and submissions. Again, I think we have probably little choice but to close this, as there already is powers in place and the Scottish Government is stating that it will not amend them. But again, I'm open to views of Kidwee. Jackson Carlow.
I'm tempted to support your proposal, Convener, but I really do feel this is a complete abdication by the government on the issue, and we've gone round in a huge circle and ended up entirely where we started. We knew that these powers existed. The issue was that they weren't being used, and they weren't being used and enforced because those who had the opportunity to use and enforce them believed there was a degree of confusion and issue as to whether or not they could, and then we tried to establish when they had. And in many ways, I feel we've failed the petitioner, because I am not myself really any clearer at the end of everything we've investigated as to why or what, and indeed what future remedy now exists. And I don't know what more to do, but I do feel that the government's response really fails to meet the fact that, whatever they may say, the issue is not being remedied on the ground.
Yeah. Well, I have a lot of sympathy with Jackson Carlow's point. again, if there's further action we as a committee can carry out to try and cast some light into this, I would certainly be up for doing that. John Wilson?
Convener, I think the petitioner, Mr Ivanov, clearly in the end part to one of his paragraphs, spells out the local authority response, that when they threaten to go on our landowners' land to tidy it up and clean it up, they've been threatened with legal action by the landowner for trespass. If that is the confusion that exists at local authority level, then clearly there needs to be some movement in terms of the guidance that's issued to local authorities and the action that's taken. The response from the policy manager in terms of the Directorate for Local Government and Communities, where he actually says in one of the bullet points, we are not aware of any evidence that amenity notices are routinely ignored or not complied with. And at the same time, the petitioner's getting the response from the local authority that they're not willing to take any action in case they get legal action taken against them. Clearly there is, as Jackson Carlos pointed out, there seems to be confusion out there. And if it's confusing for officials of the local authorities and they feel it's inappropriate to take action, either legal action or enforcement action against a landowner, then there is something wrong with the guidelines, I would argue. And I would suggest we write back to the government, make them aware of the petitioner's response and seek clarification on whether or not the Directorate actually gather information from local authorities or have surveyed local authorities to find out if there are issues regarding the enforcement notices being issued. And they give a figure in terms of less than 1% of enforcement notices result in prosecution. Is that because of failure by local authorities to take enforcement action, or is that a realistic figure to say that 99% of enforcement notices are actually resolved rather than going to prosecution? So it's trying to get clarification on those issues, Convener, it would be before we close the petition.
Yeah, that's a good point. Angus MacDonald?
Thanks, Convener. I have to say it is unfortunate the Scottish Government has no plans to amend Section 179. In fact, it's extremely disappointing. And I would agree with Mr Ivanov that the Act is incomplete without the full powers to implement it. I wouldn't feel comfortable letting this go just now. I think we still need further clarification from the government on it. The local authorities need clarification basically so they can implement the Act.
Yeah, thank you for that. Chick Brodie?
Yeah, I mean, I support that. I mean, I actually have something running in parallel with this, with the government regarding listed buildings where owners have walked away from them and just leave them. And I think part of the resistance that comes from local authorities is because of the cost of legal action if they have to take legal action and just say, well, we'll do nothing, which is unacceptable, and which is what the basis of the debate I will have in detail with the government, because there are many buildings, and certainly in part of my world, in the area that are just not tended, looked after, and trying to find the landowners almost impossible. And the council will not get involved because, as I say, because of the cost. I suspect that's the same thing here, and I support the view that we should keep this going.
I think Jackson Carr made a good point right at the start, that it is important that we go the extra mile for every petitioner that's before us. And I think we all felt uncomfortable about closing this stage. So I think let's take up John Wilson's point and pursue the Scottish Government. And though we're talking about vacant land rather than building,
we're on the
subject, I just would refer to my members' bill on dangerous buildings, which should hopefully resolve this problem if it gets through Parliament. But that's just by the by. The final current petition today is PE 1478 by Mary Cooper on the A9 Balmeedy to Tipperary dualling project. Members are noted by the clerk submissions. Could invite contributions from members on the basis that, unfortunately, what we've been told is what's been proposed is not possible under the current timescale. That's the feedback we've got from the local authority and from Transport Scotland. But again, if members have any other innovative views on how we can move this forward. John Wilson.
I was going to suggest we close the petition, but we close it by sending a letter to Transport Scotland asking them to take the views on board of the petitioner if we can get an early start to the Balmedi to Tipperary route, then that would assist in terms of trying to take this forward. But clearly, in relation to the responses, the financial implications of decoupling the two projects clearly, and the re-advertising of the contracts would bring about unnecessary delays and additional costs. So I would recommend we close the petition with the view of asking Transport Scotland to consider the timetabling for an early start to the Balmedi to Tipperary project.
Thank you for that. Members agree with that course of action?
Agree.
Thank you. Can we move to agenda item 4, which is PE 1463. This is effective thyroid and adrenal testing, diagnosis and treatment, witness expenses. So the final item is in relation to witness expenses for a roundtable event on this petition. Are the committee agreeable that responsibility for arranging for the corporate body to pay under Rule 12.4.3 any expenses of witnesses for roundtable events should be delegated to me as convener? Thank you for that. And now, thank you all for your attendance, and I now formally close the meeting. I've just got one very small item at the end.